Today we'll be having a conversation around vulnerable road users within the SAFE system and thinking about them within the SAFE system assessment framework. The term vulnerable road users just refers to anyone that is not in a car or not in a vehicle, so not in a truck or anything like that. They don't have this nice metal cage to protect them. So vulnerable road users includes pedestrians and cyclists, as well as motorcyclists. Motorcyclists, they tend to fare a little bit better in crashes compared to a pedestrian, which I'll speak to later on in today's conversation. But for the sake of ease, we just refer to vulnerable road users as pedestrians, cyclists, motorcyclists. So they do fit within that catch-all. Just wanted to recap to make sure that we're all speaking the same lingo. The risk that we are talking about for SAFE system assessments is defined as our exposure multiplied by our likelihood, multiplied by the severity. It's a very, very important equation. So we're going to hand that home in the next few modules just to make sure everyone's very comfortable with this equation. So we're always thinking exposure, likelihood, severity. The product of that is how we define our risk. Also, just to capture on the exposure topic, it's removing conflict points, reducing the number of vehicles running through there or number of pedestrians running through there, number of cyclists running through there. So an example of this exposure is, an exposure reduction is, in this instance, the traffic lane that's kind of coming towards us has been blocked off from the level rail crossing. So there's no longer that conflict point between trains, in this instance, and general traffic, because they cannot access that conflict point. So that's an example of exposure where you're actually influencing the number of vehicles going through that conflict point. Another example for exposure is where we have grade separation. So in this instance, we've got a superstructure with a highway going on up in the sky there. And that's where all general traffic and trucks and buses go. And then on a completely different level is where we've got our vulnerable road users. So we've got bike riders and cyclists, bike riders and pedestrians that use this, where's my words today? This corridor instead of actually interacting with general traffic on the above. So they're separated by grade, and that is another example of influencing that exposure. So as a recap, just for the definition, road user exposure refers to the numbers. It's always a numbers game for exposure. You're always thinking of the number of vehicles, you're thinking of the number of PEDs, the number of cyclists, the number of motorcyclists, etc. Therefore, the measurement or the unit that we use is AADT, or vehicles per day. We need to know the number of motorcyclists, the number of cyclists, the number of pedestrians within that environment that you're suggesting, that you're investigating. So you always need to tie exposure back to the number. It always needs to be a number format. Just wanted to draw out a little scenario here to further highlight what I'm talking about with exposure. So let's just say I have got a T intersection. I haven't got my stylus today. I'm using my finger, so hopefully things don't get too messy. Let's just say I got a T intersection and there's a stop line, and this is the main thoroughfare, obviously. Could be an urban environment, 60 km/h speed. This could just be a local residential street, and this is the current configuration. Let's say, for instance, I'm interested in upgrading this or improving the safety here, and I want to signalize this intersection. So get rid of some markings just to highlight this. Maybe I want to make some crosswalks, stuff like this, and it's all signalized now. That will have reduced the likelihood of the crash, of an intersection crash occurring here. So very correct in saying that that influences likelihood. However, my exposure, as we've just discussed, is the number of vehicles. It's very, very likely that before the signals and after the signals, you've still got the same amount of traffic through that conflict point. You've likely still got the same amount of cyclists. It's likely you've still got the same cyclist traffic as well. None of those things are going to greatly influence that. So the exposure for signalized intersections remains the same. If, however, I was looking at doing something else, let's get rid of this. And let's say I wanted to convert, instead of this stop line arrangement, I wanted to make this a left in, left out. So actually restricting movements. So vehicles can only turn left in or left out. I've effectively reduced the number of conflict points now because I no longer have this collision or the right out collision. And it's also very, very likely that the number of, traffic volumes through this intersection will have reduced just because those turning movements aren't available. Then it is dependent. It is possible that, if that's the only access in and out, then that's possible that the exposure will stay the same. But generally, that would influence your exposure because you would have reduced traffic volumes going through that intersection. So I just wanted to do that little example just to show you of how we think about the exposure likelihood with regards to intersections. We do have some cheat sheets, or fact sheets, I should call them. And these are available on the LMS. And basically, whilst the Austroads Guide does a very good job at explaining the Safe System assessment framework, there are these gaps within the guidelines where practitioners over the years have had to come up there with their own ways of, filling in those gaps. So as an example, how do we assess a project that has multiple distinct sections? So let's say it's a divided rural carriageway, and then it gets funneled into a single lane, undivided carriageway going through a town centre. How would you actually complete a safe system assessment with those different roadside characteristics and things like that? We've produced these fact sheets that basically give you additional guidance. So you've got a bit of direction of how to tackle these scenarios, because these are basically common questions that come up time after time completing SSAs, and a really, really handy resource. So unfortunately, we don't have the time, to run through each of those different scenarios within this module or future modules. So instead, I just encourage you to download those fact sheets. Even with the assignment that you will be completing next module, they can be a very handy resource for you. So just keep that in mind. Loretta.
Thank you. Yep, they can be found on the LMS under resources. But we just had a question still on exposure. Can we derive any relation between number of conflict points and mode of traffic with exposure? Will the increase in the number of different modes of transportation and their varying speeds lead to higher exposure?
Good question. So I'll just recapture that the exposure, and once you look at the matrix and the scoring, it will really solidify this, but the exposure will only be the number of traffic volumes. So all of the severity, or the impact angles, or the different modes and the different speeds that you're talking about, it's likely all of that would fit within the likelihood category of the risk. The exposure will exclusively be the numbers that you count for that particular user.
Thanks. One more question.
Yep.
When we signalize the intersection, we with time separate the movement, which will reduce the number of vehicles exposed to conflict. So why that considered not affecting the exposure?
Brilliant. Great question. We'll give a prize out there, because that is absolutely the wording historically that we have used. We are reducing the exposure, or the amount of space or time that a pedestrian is exposed to users crossing that. However, within the safe system framework, it's basically got a different definition for exposure. So the definition, which I ran through before, is exclusively the numbers. So it's always the numbers. I fully appreciate that that's a little bit, a bit of a deviation from what other guides and other standards and stuff like that have referenced or have used for the term exposure, but the Safe System Assessment Framework only refers to exposure as the numbers. Very, very good pickup though. That was one that I struggled with first getting the SSAs under my head as well, just why they use that term that is commonly used to mean something else. But try and put that away for the moment and only think of exposure as numbers. Okay, so this module, we're going to actually have a chat about movement and place. In case you haven't heard that term, I'll run you through that and connect that in with safe system thinking. We'll have a bit of a discussion around what kind of works and doesn't work so well for ped cyclists and motorcyclists, our vulnerable road users. And throughout the discussion, I'm going to be referencing exposure, likelihood, severity. I'm going to be writing those things down and encouraging you to write those down, just to really cement that we have got this solid understanding of what those different categories mean. Don't forget to count your wallies. So movement and place. For those who have not heard that term, no stress. I'll give you the quick introduction of it. For those that are incredibly familiar with this term, by all means, feel free to correct me if I'm not doing it justice. It's basically this type of matrix. This one's out of New South Wales. Different jurisdictions have different ways of distributing the movement and place matrix, but it more or less aligns quite well. And what we're seeing here is we're acknowledging that our road and transport networks have two primary objectives. And on the y-axis, we can see one of those objectives is the movement. So it's actually referring to the movement of people. It's not just moving cars or vehicles or whatever. It can be the movement of, getting people on buses or movement of cyclists. It's just the movement of people, right? The other objective, the other objective associated with our transport network is creating place. And what I mean by that, or placemaking, is basically we need to acknowledge that our transport network also has an adjacent area where people want to spend time, they want to meet friends, there's cafes, there's restaurants, there's bars, and we need to acknowledge that our road transport network also has that function where we need to basically create a streetscape that supports that activity. And so the way that this is categorized within the movement and place framework is it's drawn up like a graph, as we can see here, or a matrix. And as you can see, we've got higher movement. It's further up the graph with low place. This one's always the easiest one. Perfect example of high movement, which has got no place function, is like a motorway. We don't want people spending any time there, and the movement of people there is incredibly important. So the further along that scale is indicative of the level of importance. The other categories that we've got are a movement corridor. So that would be where we've got, it's likely an arterial network, and movement is very important. Placemaking is less important in those environments. Vibrant streets, these ones are generally the hardest because they both have a high movement function, but also it's important that people can dwell and spend time and enjoy that space. So think of it like your high streets within your townships or CBD areas, things like that. Places for people, this is where the movement is actually not considered a priority, but the priority is the people and creating that nice environment for people. So this could be malls or pedestrianized areas. You still might have some movement of traffic, but it's not the overarching objective of those environments. And finally, local streets. Now, local streets, they have a low movement function and also a low place function. Just be wary if you're talking to any community members and you mention that their local street is low movement and low place value, they might get offended, but it's thinking of this at a statewide level, sort of very global level. It's hard to say that someone's residential street, has quite a significant impact at a state level. So that's why local streets get into that category there. So just as an example, just to get this discussion going, places for people, it could look something like this, where you may have some traffic movements, but you can see this is not an area where you'd expect high volumes of traffic, or you'd expect high speeds for that matter. This very much does look like an area for people to enjoy and, to make the most of. So rather than talk through it, let's have a go at an example. And within the chat, what I'll get you to do is your job is to transform this environment into the category we just discussed then. So I'll just go back. I want you to transform that environment into something that is for people, places for people. So currently we've got a 40km/h speed limit. We've got buses, we've got pedestrians, we've got cyclists, we've got general traffic. Within the chat, I want to see your treatment options to create that places for people environment. And importantly, when you're putting it in the chat, write down whether your treatments influence the exposure, the likelihood, or the severity. So you can just put that in brackets after you've said your treatment. It's very possible that your treatment suggestions will actually influence one or more of those, and that's fine. You can just do L, S if it influences both. I just want to start to apply some of these treatments to these environments and ensure that we're understanding what risk category that should be attributed to. So I'll give you 60 seconds to have a go at this. You can see people have already got it started, which is great. And I will have a drink of water. Give you another 30 seconds because it looks like we're still getting some answers through. So. Right. Don't get too hung up if you didn't get a chance to put in your suggestions. I'm going to just run through some of the ideas that we've seen come through and just chat through those risk classifications as well. So, speed, I saw mentioned multiple times. So, if we're able to bring down speeds, not only would that have a safety benefit, but that also does improve the connectivity and the accessibility for people. It does create that places for people. So completely agree with that. Speed, the way that we would actually categorize that is we would say that speed influences both the likelihood and severity. So lots of people just went with severity, which is spot on. You can understand that. If you've got lower speeds, if a collision occurs, hopefully it's more survivable. That relationship seems to be well understood. But the speed reduction also reduces likelihood because there's a few reasons. If you're driving faster, your cone of vision or what you can actually see is significantly reduced. The slower you're going, the more you're able to see and witness. So if a pedestrian steps out, if you're going at a lower speed, you're much likely to slow down, brake, avoid the collision. Similarly, with lower speeds, it takes less distance to come to a stop. So if someone steps out in the road 30 meters in front of you, if you're traveling at 40 or 50 kilometers per hour, you probably hit that person. If you're traveling at 30, you're more likely to avoid the collision altogether. So speed reductions, likelihood and severity. I can see removal of cars, removal of buses, and that it's been correctly identified as exposure because we're looking at traffic volumes there. Making it one way. Now, this is an interesting one, and I can see that it has gone for exposure and likelihood. And I think that's a pretty fair assessment. So exposure, because presumably if we're making it one way, we're going to reduce the AADT, the vehicles per day through there. Ideally, you'd have some kind of traffic modeling or something like that to support that assessment. But I think, practically or, theoretically, that makes sense. If you're making this road one way, you would see reductions in traffic. So that would be exposure. But also likelihood as well, because there's just less opportunity for instance, head-on collisions, suspect would be significantly reduced because it's just a one-way environment. So I agree with that. Lots of narrowing the existing road. I think that's a great suggestion. Creating dedicated paths or off-road paths for bicyclists to get them away from the carriageway. It's brilliant. That would reduce the likelihood of a collision just because they've got their own separate facility. I wouldn't attribute that to exposure because if you've got a separated cycle path, it just becomes less likely that there's going to be a collision with a vehicle. Right? The number of cyclists using that route would stay the same, you would expect. If anything, it might go up. You would probably expect it would go up. Removing vehicles, pedestrianisation, line marking, one way. All right, lots of great suggestions here. I'm sorry I can't get through them all. Is this diagram from Australia? No, this one is from the US. And we did have to flip it, so the mirror image of it. But we just like the pictures. It looks like a nice artistic rendition. But let's have a look at what this artist has done to transform this space into a place for people. And you'll see some of those suggestions that you nominated actually can be found within this artistic rendition. So we do actually have a much lower speed here, 10 kilometer per hour. So this is a shared street. So it's no longer just dedicated traffic lanes and parking lanes. It's more of a shared environment. So when you are at these lower speeds, you don't actually need to create separate cycling infrastructure. Instead, you can get bike riders onto the carriageway. You don't need a separate bike path because the speeds are so low. So that's one way that you could reduce that one as a risk. This one has also been made one way. It was noted by a few people in the chat. And I might draw a diagram on the next slide about one of the considerations associated with one-way traffic. But you can see automatically that even this expanded footpath here, it's just, this is much more inviting of a streetscape. And you've got a lot more, enticement to actually use this and stay and meet friends and enjoy this as a place for people, as opposed to just more traffic lanes and ensuring that there's no delays or congestion associated with all of that. Anyway, I'll draw a little diagram because I just want to make a note about the one-way arrangement. And this is going to be an aerial, and it's going to be not at all to scale, but bear with me. Let's say I've got, a block of houses here, right? And this has already gone not the way I wanted it to. And this is a major thoroughfare, right, arterial road. And let's say we're making this one way and this one way. So the road environment that we were looking at is like something like that, that component there. So if that was previously two-way, now we've made it one way. I think it's pretty reasonable to say that there will be reductions in traffic volumes, so exposure would be influenced. Very important, though, to acknowledge that where is that traffic going? Because if they're using an adjacent corridor, that's where they're getting pushed to use instead, to complete their journey to get wherever they want to get. What are the implications of that? Because potentially this corridor where you're pushing them to is also not suited. So the reason I'm mentioning this is because if you're completing a safe system assessment and your scope is, look at this, tell me what we can do, tell me the scores, make some recommendations, etc. You're completely within your right to say, we could make this a place for people. We could investigate making this a one-way. But I think it's important to add a caveat there for the project team, just so that they can be aware that that may have other ramifications. Invariably, if you make one change on the network, it does have, can have other operational effects, a ripple effect on other aspects of the network. It's not your job as a safe system assessor to then go out and have a look at this network and determine those ongoing effects, unless the client has specifically said, this is your scope. The reason for that is you could easily just continue to go further and further and further from where you initially started. So if you've been scoped with a particular area, draw a fence around it, that's what you'll be referencing, that's what you'll be assessing. If you believe that there could be implications for other parts of the network associated with any of your recommendations, you can make a note of that and just say, consider investigating doing a traffic network assessment of other locations due to this recommendation. So I just wanted to highlight that one there. Another way this environment could have been transformed is to prioritize, public transport. You can see this is an American reference, transit, as they call it, and also the Z in prioritize. So prioritizing public transports and also cycling. So in this example, we've got a 30 km/h speed, and we have provided separated cycling facilities. We're not saying riders should be using the bus lanes in this example. 30 kilometers is generally the rule of thumb and the accepted speed for bike riders sharing a traffic lane. However, if you've got heavy vehicles using that, buses, we tend to be a bit wary of that because incredibly low speeds with buses or heavy vehicles, collisions with cyclists, can result in fatal outcomes. So 10 km/h, if you're hit on a bike by a bus, that can result in very serious outcomes. So that's probably why in this artistic rendition there is that separation. If it was more just a general traffic lane, you might actually say we can push bike riders into the traffic lane and create a shared environment, which I'll show you in a few slides' time as well. Loretta, are there any questions? You're on mute there, pal.
Yes, thank you. Lucky you could. I thought you could read my lips. But the question, there's a lot of really good discussion coming through and everyone helping out, which is great. The last question here is will the SSA call recommend to conduct a road safety audit, or is the audit that recommends to do an SSA?
Good question. I guess from experience, an SSA very well may say, actually, let me backtrack then. I think within an SSA, the treatments that you are recommending are incredibly high level. So you're saying, reduce the carriageway width, make it one way, extend the footpath. You're not giving out measurements. You're not drawing a concept design or anything like that. And they are just high level recommendations. So it still requires the project team to, review that, to either accept that, say, yep, we can do that, or no, that's not feasible. And then to deliver on that outcome if they decided to. So let's say they decide to go with the one-way treatment. They would then create another design drawing where generally within industry, a separate road safety audit would be completed for that product. I would say that's fairly well embedded within industry to have that conducted. So it might be superfluous to mention within a SAVE system assessment that any of the treatments that I'm recommending should have a road safety audit completed. Just because it's, I guess, relatively well understood that those types of infrastructure transport projects would have that RSA conducted. It's a good question though. The other way around though is would an auditor, so someone doing a road safety audit, recommend an SSA? I haven't seen that done in practice. An auditor will go there and just say, here's the risks, here's the level of the risk. That's it, job done. They're more likely within an audit to, recommend things like consider doing swept path diagrams to confirm specific turning movements can be met, or additional traffic modeling to, confirm the phasing and the times are all set up if it's a signalized intersection. But Generally, I haven't seen either of those two reference each other and recommend one or the other. In module 5 for this course, we actually talk a bit about the differences, I guess, between the road safety audit and the safe system assessment. So if all of that sounded a bit unfamiliar, that's okay. We will talk in a bit more detail. I'm going to give you another example, and during this example, you can go out and have a cup of coffee or have a stretch. But in this next example, I want to transform another artistic rendition into a local street. So this has got a low place value, but also a low movement function. And this is the local street that I'm talking about. So in the chat, as you've been doing, list down any recommendations and make a note if it influences exposure, likelihood, and severity. I'm going to give everyone 4 minutes to complete this exercise, but also get up, go for a stretch, go have a cup of tea. So continue that exercise and have a little break. Right. Welcome back, everyone. Hopefully you had a nice stretch. I'm just going to run through these comments that we've had in the chat. So the first one is that I see there is reducing the speed, and I see exposure has been put in there, but speed would just be likelihood severity. Would still have the same traffic volumes going through there if we reduce the speed, unless you've got evidence to say that if you drop in the speed, you're going to have less traffic there. So just be mindful of that one. Reduction in speed would be likelihood and severity. Dedicated cycling lanes, likelihood. Widening the footpaths or narrower than carriageway, lots of likelihood there. Raised crossing points I saw as likelihood and severity, that's spot on. Decreasing the number of lanes, I agree that that's probably going to be likelihood. It's probably also going to exposure, but once again, you just want to clarify that assumption. But it makes sense to me. Removing parking. I would put removing parking down to likelihood, because that's going to open up sight lines and things like that if you've got parking removed there. So pedestrians can cross a bit easier. Ideally, you would combine that with a widening of the footpath there. I wouldn't attribute that to exposure though, because you'd still have the same throughput of traffic. So one way this one could be reconfigured is another one-way street example. And we can see we've got the wider footpath there. We've got streetscape improvements. I think greening the environment is something that is very underutilized, and something that really does add a lot of street appeal, and improve the amenity of the environment. Even doing these type of chicane treatments, traffic calming treatments, bringing down the speed. So it's not just relying on signage, it's 20 kilometers per hour. It's actually creating an environment that feels like it should be low speed. So those are all good suggestions. I can largely see that we're getting good classification throughout the ELS. The exposure one in particular seems to be one that's catching people out, which is not uncommon. So I'll just reiterate, the exposure would only be influenced if you're actually reducing the traffic volumes. So all the cyclist volumes, all the pedestrian volumes. If you're reducing those volumes, those numbers, then you're influencing exposure. The last one, you're welcome to pop in the chat any of your own ideas, but I'm just going to talk through it, which is, second last one, which is the vibrant streets. So this is where you've got a high movement function of the network, but also somewhere that people want to actually enjoy. These are tricky spaces, and a lot of our network, has these and doesn't necessarily do a great job for the movement or for people. So there's some good discussions to have within these spaces. Let's say this is what our existing, movement, vibrant access corridor look like. 7 kilometers per hour, and this kind of service road thing going on. So let's say there's lots of bars and pubs and stuff that people want to spend time here with, and also on the other side of the road, there's a lot of roadway to cross there to get there. Now, in this scenario or this example, we've actually got an overhead structure or a pedestrian walkway. Now that's interesting because what I'm doing is I'm providing grade separation for pedestrians. So they no longer have conflict points across the carriageway. And that might seem like a big tick because, you've managed to influence exposure finally, because you've actually reduced the number of pedestrians because they're on a different grade, they're on a different level, they're not exposed to all of that traffic. However, as a safe system assessor, you need to be pragmatic and you need to actually reflect on human behavior. And we know that if we've just got stairs, well, a lot of the population cannot use that. So if you're in a wheelchair or mobility device, or you've got a pram, you're probably not going to be using the stairs. So that means it significantly reduces the effectiveness of that grade separation. And in fact, even in this little artistic rendition, we can see we've got people crossing at grade. We've got people in the median, people there. So it's unrealistic to just assume because you've got that grade separation. It could also be like an underpass, unless it's 100% on the desired path and pedestrians just would not use the at-grade solution. Unless you can, hand on heart say that, it's likely that the exposure risk is still there, even with the presence of an overhead structure like this. So just be mindful of that. The other note I wanted to make about this particular environment is the use of the pedestrian fencing. So obviously that's been installed to kind of corral pedestrians to use the overhead structure. But once again, reflect on human behavior. We know that pedestrians will go wherever they want, or take the path that they want to do. And so they will jump over those fences, or what's not uncommon is to see a pedestrian to get stuck on the carriageway and then go and seek that entry. So actually getting stuck on the live traffic lane, which is not a great idea. So be quite wary of just assuming that because you've got that pedestrian fencing in place, you're going to get 100% compliance with that. Transforming this into a more vibrant street. So once again, widening facilities, more footpath, things like bicycle storage, bicycle hooks, things like that. Separated bicycle treatments. We've got a bus lane that's been implemented and separate traffic lanes as well. So there still is quite a lot of movement through here. It's just being redistributed. So it's not just all passenger vehicles that have the priority. It's people that want to catch a bus, people that want to get by on bike, or even walking up and down here. It's just a lot more accessible. So it's still got the movement function, but it's doing a much better job at having the place function as well. And I'll zoom in just on the minor leg up here. It's a bit hard to see, but there is a raised platform that's been installed on the minor leg. So it's created this continuous footpath along here, which is another really, really attractive facility for improving both the safety and the accessibility of these streetscape environments. So it just makes it a lot nicer when you're just walking at one grade and not going down to carriageway level and things like that. Speaking of intersections, I just wanted to make a note of this cycling treatment. So this is referred to as a protected intersection, and it is used to improve the safety performance of traditional intersections for cyclists. So we know that intersections for bike riders are a weak point in the link, so to speak, and they have lots of risks associated with them. A protected intersection looks something like this, and the way that it's kind of evolved is you install these, what's referred to as a corner refuge islands at each quadrant of the intersection. And the reason that they are installed is if you've got a left-turning vehicle, like that, and you've got a bike rider going through like that, that conflict angle is much closer to perpendicular. It's much easier for that left-turning vehicle to be able to see the bike rider. So they're just improved sight lines associated with protected intersections. I'll do a comparison. Traditionally, the way that this intersection would be set up is you'd have a bike rider on the inside lane, somewhere there. And if they wanted to go through, they're basically on the passenger side door, which is the blind spot. So left-turning vehicles and that through cyclist movement, they have a very acute crash angle. It's just not conducive to good sight lines. So protected intersections to improve those sight lines, where we do have kind of cycling corridors.
Sorry, Max, just back on that
Yes.
one.
Yeah.
With the green crossing, which is like the
Oh.
zebra crossing.
Yep.
Could that confuse drivers with the stop line for the pedestrian crossing?
That's just what they do in America. Yeah, and Canada as well. We'd either do a whole block of the green over there or not demarcate it. So yeah, that's just a jurisdictional work. Good pickup. Let's give a prize out there, Loretta. I'll give another prize if anyone in the chat wants to have a guess as why in this one. So we've got a separated bicycle lane here, and we've got these separators being used, but they're only about 300 mil wide. And my question is, why do you think such a narrow little separator has been used in this specific photo, in this scenario? And just in answer to Raman's question, if it's priority for vulnerable users, doesn't matter if it's white or green, you're correct. It does not matter. The pavement color does not have a regulatory effect. It's just like a supporting treatment. All right, and yes, the reason that we've got a narrow separation here is because there's no parking lane here. So this is a traffic lane, it's a right turn lane. We're not expecting vehicle doors opening, therefore we can provide a smaller degree of separation there. In a perfect world, obviously you'd try and get as much as possible, but when you are working curb to curb, you're utilizing existing drainage assets. You want to make sure that you're being pragmatic and working within your existing constraints. So give a prize out there, Loretta, to the no parking lane there or no dooring risk there. It's very well spotted. The final one was just movement corridors. And in this environment, what can we do? What kind of triggers do we have in place to still improve safety, but yeah, it's not necessarily a place that we want people spending a lot of time in. And it's just going to go back to that point that we chatted about in our last module, which is the idea of raised intersections. So we showed this one as an example, creating raised platforms. This is a heavy vehicle network as well. So buses and trucks, they use this network often. 10,000 vehicles a day plus. And there still is that ability to be implementing raised platforms and vertical deflection in these environments. So I know it can be challenging to have those conversations with stakeholders, but there are precedents and they can work, and it's all about improving the safety performance of that intersection. Yeah. Right, so let's have a good chat now about peds and cyclists. We tend to consider them the most vulnerable of all our users. Severe injury can occur just at 20 kilometers per hour. There's a 10% risk of that occurring. Fatals occur almost certainly at 50 or above. Our young and old are even more vulnerable. Our young, because they haven't quite got the cognitive ability to pick gaps in traffic or understand the risks associated with those types of decisions, and the old, just due to their frail nature and the way that they're built, unable to withstand such high levels of force. The reason that we're bringing these key points into the discussion is if you were conducting a safe system assessment and it was outside a school, perhaps the way that you analyze the crash severity for particular crash types, you might bump it up a little bit in terms of the scoring because you're expecting lots of very vulnerable road users, lots of very young people in that area. So ideally, we want to manage speeds to, it says around 20 kilometers per hour, but I'd say we're miles away from trying to achieve 20 kilometers. We're miles away from trying to achieve 30 kilometers. 30 kilometers is generally taken as the rule of thumb. If you're able to manage conflict speeds, where you do have cyclists and pedestrians to 30 kilometers per hour, you'll have a much better safe system aligned solution. So separated treatments, they can be referred to as the protected bicycle lane or separated bicycle lane, Copenhagen bicycle lane. It's a different terms for the same thing. The way that these are actually constructed, it's kind of about flipping the traditional cross-section of a road, because conventionally we would have a parking lane directly adjacent the curb, and then would have a bicycle lane, and then a travel lane or a traffic lane adjacent that. And the issue with putting cyclists in this space, got to be careful of my drawing there. The issue with putting the cyclists within that space is that they're within the dooring zone. So as soon as the vehicle door opens, there's the conflict point. The other issue with putting bike riders in that traditional conventional space is, if an errant vehicle is traveling out of their lane, the first thing that they're hitting is the bicycle lane, or they need to access parking, they need to cross over the bicycle lane. So there's just all these myriad of ways that these conflicts can occur. The separated treatment or protected bicycle lane, it flips that arrangement. So instead, we've got the parking lane shifted out away from the curb and channel, and we've got the bicycle lane adjacent to the curb and channel. Ideally, you'd have separators that are wide enough to completely house an open door. So it's about that 1.2 meter mark. Just so if the passenger door does open, it's not actually opening into the bicycle lane. But we know that these features not only improve the the safety of bike riders, so like the crash reduction factor, but the perceived level of risk. So bike riders just feel more comfortable riding in these types of facilities. And if you've got, if you're looking at strategic cycling corridors or areas that you want to improve the uptake of riding, these types of treatments should really be prioritized because they are the most attractive for bike riders. Spoke before about the idea of a protected intersection for cyclist safety. And there's also this treatment that is referred to as a protected roundabout. This is also for cyclist safety and also pedestrians. So roundabouts do have wonderful safety benefits for vehicle-to-vehicle collisions. Unfortunately, those safety benefits rarely extend to pedestrians and to cyclists. In fact, roundabouts tend to make things worse for pedestrians and cyclists. This is a solution that improves the safety for peds and cyclists. And at the core of it, what is occurring is we want to get bike riders out of the circulating area. As soon as they enter that space, they can either get pushed to the periphery, or drivers that are entering the roundabout will just fail to give way to them, fail to see them, and you just enter the roundabout and there's a collision there. There's a host of reasons why it's not a good idea to have riders within the circulating area, unless it's very, very low speed and local streets and stuff like that. So instead, the protected roundabout configuration, it actually brings riders away from that circulating area, crossing at very distinct points. You can see we've got well-defined conflict points at each of those legs. And they've also got the priority as well. So drivers need to give way to pedestrians and to cyclists at each of these legs. And that is approaching and on departure. So it's not a treatment to improve congestion. It's very likely that there could be a worse level of service for those congestion metrics, general traffic. This is a treatment to improve safety for pedestrians and cyclists. It's most appropriate where you're not got lots of traffic and it's not like an arterial network. It wouldn't really work very well on multi-lane roundabouts or anything like that. This is more local anyway. Loretta.
Just a question that's come in. Would the separated facility increase the aggressive cyclist behaviour to drivers and pedestrians?
So we actually did an evaluation on this roundabout. So this is obviously just the rendered version of it. It's since been installed. It's Moray Street, if anyone's interested. Moray Street in South Melbourne. There's 2 of these protected roundabouts that have been installed. And we completed the evaluation for this type of treatment and didn't acknowledge or didn't have any of that sentiment that was, captured from bike users or drivers through that area. One of the interesting takeaways as part of the evaluation we did was we recorded cyclist preferred movements. And interestingly, if you were riding through and you were doing a through movement, so let's say you were ignoring the protected facility and just using the circulating area. So in other words, not riding around like this. There was about 93% of riders using the protected facility. So there still is a cohort that will be like, that one's out of my way. I can do it much quicker. I feel safe. I'm confident. I'm riding through and just using the circulating area. For those doing right turns, doing that using the circulating area, it reduced a bit. It went to about 23% using the circulating area, 77% using the protected facility. So I think it's unreasonable to expect that you'd get 100% compliance with any treatment that you really implement, but specifically with things to do with pedestrians or cycling connectivity, because we do have a range of demographics within the cycling community. And there will be those that will just take the route that's the easiest and most convenient for them. So I don't see that as a failure on the project by any means. It's just not the most salient metric that needed to be measured. Here's just what it looks like out on the ground. And just to reiterate, drivers do need to yield both approaching the roundabout and then on departure as well. They also need to yield to peds and cyclists. Zoom in there, see if you can see that give way as well. So as you're going into the roundabout, give way to peds and cyclists, and as you're departing as well. So that's when we've got the single lane roundabouts. But when we're talking multi-lane, things get a bit trickier because it's very difficult to be able to provide that continuity for bike riders, basically. There's issues with providing the continuous crossing point for sightline restrictions. And so unless you've got significant gaps in between the traffic lanes, you'd be hesitant to create those protected roundabouts where you've got multiple lanes. But what I wanted to just do with this example is just as a bit of a demonstration. I'll go back, just swapped over there. And if I was looking at this for the first time, I would immediately assume that the east-west leg is a high movement corridor. And my assumption is based on there's multiple traffic lanes. It's a divided carriageway. To me, that is saying it's important that this is a high movement corridor. Could be high speed as well, I'm not sure, but it has that appearance. So that's the east-west leg. If I look north-south, so look at this leg that's going on at the top of the screen, I wouldn't say that this has the same movement function. It's single lane, undivided carriageway. And we're kind of tying this into the movement of place that we were talking about before. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because the movement classification and also the place classification can then influence the way that you actually treat or recommend solutions. So to put that into perspective, if you're a bike rider and you wanted to cross the major thoroughfare, we'll see the designer has made a note to install grab handles, just those U-bollard things, for cyclists at these crossing points. In other words, priority is maintained for general traffic. Vulnerable road users need to stop and give way. If I compare that to what it's like crossing over the less important movement corridor, once again, we'll have a look at what the designer has said, and they're saying, let's install a raised crossing point so that we can actually award the priority to cyclists and to pedestrians. So it's just a demonstration that you can have different treatment selections dependent on what those movement functions are for your road environments. The other reason I like this example is because, just going back to what I was saying before, if the east-west can be identified as a significant movement corridor, it's got a high movement function, maintaining that movement is, a priority. It's an objective of that network. That same objective is likely also applicable to bike riders. They just want to go east-west as well. So giving them priority for that east-west movement, it ties in very, very well with that overall strategic function of this corridor that we're looking at. So lots of good insights out of that one. For cycling treatments, as I mentioned before, we can look to share the traffic lane where we've got operating speeds around 30 kilometers per hour, because we know that that is the impact speed threshold for vulnerable road user crashes. The way that we actually facilitate the lane sharing is through the use of sharrows, which is just those little pavement markings, which stands for shared arrows. Communicates both to riders and to drivers that this is now a shared traffic lane. Bike riders do not have to ride as close to the curb as possible. They're encouraged just to claim the lane, to take a central position. For those reasons, you can understand why you would want to only do that in low speed environments. When we're getting higher speeds, 30 to 70, we're expecting protected bicycle lanes or getting cyclists off the road. Anything above that, it should be by default off the road bicycle lanes. It's just unrealistic to expect that we can manage speeds and the forces involved within those collisions at those speeds. Loretta.
Have the sharrows actually proven to be effective, particularly on roads where speed limits are 40 or 50 kilometers per hour? Should speed limits be reduced if sharrows are to be installed? I don't see much value of painting sharrows on the road if nothing else changes.
I agree with that assessment. Yeah, you don't want to be doing it if the operating speeds are too high, because you'll just be neglected, and it also won't create a comfortable riding environment if you're continually getting overtaken by cars and things like that. Are they effective? It's a very pertinent topic, because there was some research out of the University of Boston from memory a few years ago where they actually analyzed some of the areas where they have installed the sharrows, and they made a note that the crash risk has gone up. So it's actually made riders a bit more, I wouldn't say aggressive, but complacent in riding in those environments. And yeah, they've had an increase in the level of risk associated with those treatments. Caveat by saying that that is one study of one part of the world where perhaps they were not the most appropriate treatments to start with. So perhaps not the right speeds, not the right traffic environment. So I wouldn't say that that's indicative of sharrows not working anywhere. But there are different schools of thought around to the application of sharrows. And I suppose just to give you a bit of solace, like they're still very much included within our jurisdictional guidelines, and you'll find them in Austroads, and you'll find them in other international practices as well. So it's not like just Australia and New Zealand are doing these things. They're in Europe, they're in the Netherlands, they're in America and Canada and things like that. So yeah, it's a good point to bring up, because just painting, we know that using line marking or pavement markings, that's not infrastructure. It's not as good as a protected facility, but yeah, it's good point. I like it. Oh yeah, pedestrians, sorry. So what we know that works well for pedestrians is creating clear crossing points at desired paths, particularly where we are able to raise those crossing points, what's referred to as a wombat crossing. And the reason that we like these so much is they reduce the likelihood of a crash and the severity. So the likelihood, if you've got pedestrians on a raised kind of surface, they become a little bit more prominent. So it's easier to see them if you're having to stop and give way. But predominantly because of the ramp, that will actually wash off speed. So if you were completely ignorant to this is a crossing that you need to yield and give way, because this is raised and you've got that ramp, that is going to wash off vehicle speed. So if there is a collision, it's going to be at lower speeds. Just go through that one. I'll just another photo of it. I've got this example here. This is in South Australia. This snap of a work site, so construction site, and you've got some workers behind the barrier system there. We'll give a prize out, Loretta, if anyone can tell me what is the speed zone for construction works in South Australia. So if you're doing any road works, what is the speed brought down to? It's 25 kilometers. I'm not sure who said that one first there, Loretta, but we'll give you a prize out there. 25 kilometers per hour, the only jurisdiction to do that in Australia. Anywho, whilst the workers were, busy behind here doing some signaling, cabling bits and pieces, they installed some rigid concrete barriers. They brought down the speed to 25 kilometers per hour, finished the job. They pack up all this safety equipment and then things return to the normal conditions. The reason we include this as a bit of a metaphor is when people are working, the risks associated with the road environment are well understood, and we have lots of safety protocols in place and risk mitigation strategies to ensure that the safety of those workers are prioritized. So, we've got to do safe work methods statements or JSAs, or, get the actual formal approval to be able to do works and things like that to work on the road. There's all these mechanisms in place and people reviewing those, whether there's adequate controls to protect those workers. As soon as it's not considered work, though, and it's just an everyday situation, people can stand in that same area where those workers were and be exposed to those high level risks with no safety metrics in place, no safety controls in place. And, the argument could be made that the workers, they're down there doing their job and they're distracted, they're not looking out for traffic and stuff like that. But I think it's a fair argument to say that pedestrians at the traffic lights are also very distracted, and they're, texting a friend, or they're just looking at their shoes or whatever it is. They're not necessarily always expecting to have to dive out of the way if there's an errant vehicle. So there's a little bit of that. Yeah. And as rightly pointed out, is certainly legislated for workers. If you're a general member of the public, you do not have that same safety net. It's not a requirement. Tram stops or light rail stops. This one I wanted to just mention. It's also relevant at bus stops, where basically as soon as a pedestrian or anyone knows that their tram or their bus is arriving, they will just go for it. They will absolutely put the blinkers on and neglect any of the surrounding road environments and just head straight across. So if you were doing a safe system assessment and there were, bus stops or anything like that, be reasonable to assume that you'd have some relatively high risk pedestrian crossing activities, because people just want to make sure they get onto that bus. Raised intersections, we spoke about this before, reducing likelihood and severity. It's been used in local streets, it's been used in arterial roads, been used in a realm of different environments. You can also just raise the threshold. So if you were just doing a T intersection, you could raise, the actual T if the footpath was closer to there. But in this instance, we've got the footpath that's quite well set back. And so raising that conflict point as opposed to right up to the T, because that's where you want your pedestrian connectivity and also the improved safety outcomes where that conflict point is, the slower speeds there. We've included this graph which shows the casualty crashes between 94 and 2010, and just wanted to make a little note of this period here, why we are seeing such a dramatic change. So you can see it goes down quite dramatically in between those dates, and that's what's referred to as a step change. So it's no longer just like a gradual trend going downward. It's something has changed and it's gone down in a significant way over a short period of time. And the reason that we're seeing it in the year 2002 is because that is the year that our jurisdictions decided to drop the urban default from 60 kilometers per hour to 50 kilometers per hour. And that one kind of policy change, we notice automatically this reduction in casualty crashes occurring. The reason we make a note of that is safe system assessments tend to be very project focused, which is excellent, and just maximizing the safety benefits associated with that specific project. But in order to see more of these step changes heading closer towards zero, we do need to also be advocating for speeds that are more forgiving and more survivable, where we do have higher incidence of pedestrian or vulnerable road user activity. Motorcyclists. So as discussed, we do consider these parts of the vulnerable road user category. And there's 5 S's that we use to describe different factors associated with their level of risk. Of course, it's S's because we're at Safe System Solutions. The first 3, and I'm going to talk through these going forward, but the first 3, sight, surface, and signs, all influence the likelihood of a crash. Strike, it's got to do with the severity, and the speed, as we touched on before, is likelihood and severity. So just to run you through what each of those means, but before I do, just want to acknowledge there was some research a few years ago, don't expect you to read these graphs, which was just acknowledging that motorcycle riders tend to fare better than that 30 kilometer per hour safe system threshold that we said for pedestrians and cyclists. The reason being, motorcyclists got the nice helmet going on for them. They might be wearing leathers to protect them, but also the general motorcycle demographic doesn't feature those very, very young, or doesn't feature those very, very old. They tend to be a bit more robust individuals. So it's a slightly stronger cohort. So there is evidence to say that they can withstand slightly higher speeds, but for the purposes of the safe system assessment and just for ease of reference, we put the motorcyclists in the vulnerable road user category, and we look at that 30 kilometer impact speed threshold. So the sights is all about your ability to be able to see a motorcyclist in a given environment. Even small things within the roadside are able to mask or create a sightline obstruction. So in this instance, we're just looking at an intersection and we're making a decision whether we can enter the stream or not. And a moment later in time, we can actually see there was a motorbike there the whole time. So if you're doing a safe system assessment, you'd be having a look at intersections, looking at your side triangles and trying to ascertain if any of those obstructions in the way could potentially create sighting issues for motorcyclists. And your recommendation could be, to open up those sight lines. So potentially trimming vegetation, removing trees, offsetting power poles, or the barrier systems and things like that. Very, very easy to be hidden if you are a motorcyclist. The surface conditions for motorbike riders are incredibly important. They've got two very small patches of contact with the surface. So as soon as there is a surface defect, they're likely the first ones to know about it. The other thing to be mindful of with surface is during the turning movements, you've actually got motorcyclist center of gravity being angled, so to speak. So it can take very, very small changes in the vertical tolerance or in the actual adhesion of the aggregate or things like that. If there's, loose gravel, it can take very, very small defects like that to actually destabilize a motorcyclist, and potentially have those types of crashes. In a more urban setting, something to be mindful of is the use of metal plates, as a temporary fix to cover up excavations and things like that. Be particularly concerned about installing them in areas where motorcyclists are performing those turning movements, because you are likely to get the skid resistance or that level of friction that would be attributed with the adjacent pavement. So something just to make a note of. The other S we've got is signs. Motorcyclists tend to rely on signs a lot more than general motorists, particularly when it comes to advisory speeds. So, when it says a 30 km/h advisory speed, it's a real cue to motorcyclists that they need to slow down, and it's going to be a tight hairpin turn or whatever it is. They are readily understood and accessed by the motorcycle community and needs to be considered as part of any project where you're expecting motorcycle activity. The strike is all to do with severity, and this is basically if a motorcyclist is to come off at a particular location, what are they hitting and what are the potential outcomes of that crash? So the ANCAP system, they do some motorcycle testing. They put a specific motorcycle dummy and things like that, and they dress up in all the leathers. This is an example of one of those crash test dummies just going straight into a guard fence post, not survivable at all. There are underrun protections or motorcycle protection devices that can be installed underneath those systems, so you don't have that point hazard of the post. It's not going to be fun hitting the underrun protection either. I would still expect quite serious outcomes for that crash, but it is able to dissipate some of that energy over a longer period of time as opposed to that blunt trauma that's occurring. Final S is to do with speed. So as I mentioned before, riders do rely a lot on advisory speeds. And whenever we're talking about speeds, if we're able to reduce operating speeds, we're able to influence the likelihood and the severity of crashes occurring. So just ensuring that, our advisory speeds are reliable, they're consistent, they make sense, they're legible. Also, interestingly, in this example, they've used a different type of post that is not, just like a metal post. These are actually frangible. They break away. So if motorcyclists were to come off at this curve, they could break through that sign and not have another fixed hazard close to that edge of the roadway that they could collide with. Loretta, let's finish with a quiz, please.
Okay, just bringing that up now.
All right. True or false? If using a proper helmet and good safety gear, a motorcyclist can be considered as a passenger vehicle / car in safe system crash false tolerances. So if you're wearing the nice helmet, you got all the leathers on, can we just assume a motorcyclist is just like a passenger vehicle? True or false? Or unintelligible? Well, it doesn't say false there, Loretta. It says flays.
That's a good pickup. I'll have to fix that. Thank you.
That's all right.
Sorry.
True or flays? We'll give you 5 more seconds. 3, 2, 1, and we'll end the poll there. And share, and yes, that is flays. That is false. Just because you're wearing all of that equipment does not mean that you've got the airbag, you don't have the crumple zone, you don't have all that wonderful technology in a passenger vehicle. So we can't assume that you're able to withstand the same impact speeds as if you were in that big metal cage. So good to see the majority going for that one. And that's all for the content today. I'll head over to Loretta just to run through the task for the end of today's module.
Thank you. Well, it's pretty basic actually today. It's just a quiz. So in the LMS, under module 3, there is a quiz to complete. So you've got a few minutes, I guess, to complete it, today if you like. But yeah, it's pretty simple. Clicking on the attempt quiz and answering those questions. Going back to something we made reference to earlier in regards to the fact sheet. So under the resources, those fact sheets are here, but also I did send a link in the chat where you can find them on our website as well. So yes, that's all for module 3, just completing the quiz. And that's all from me and the LMS today.
Fabulous. Thank you, Loretta, and thanks everyone. And big shout out to Roman at the start for getting involved. And yeah, really appreciate you sharing your side and having that discussion. Look forward to our next module on Thursday. Remember to come a few minutes early, and Loretta will be dishing out more prizes for trivia. And I hope you all have a lovely day. And yeah, you can smash out the quiz now.
Thanks, everyone. See you Thursday.
See you
Thanks,
later.
Max. Bye.